Hello everyone. I am Alice of KHR Arts and Cloud Orchid Publishing, and today we are going to talk about common mistakes in writing fantasy. Now, I have touched on this a bit in some of my past videos, and it is a common thing that I complain about on Twitter and on Facebook, but I felt that we just need a whole video about it, y'all. So, one of the biggest number one mistakes that people make with writing fantasy is they think that you don't need any rules. This can't be further from the truth. Fantasy doesn't mean pure anarchy. That is not what fantasy means. I mean, if you want to write a novel that is pure anarchy, I mean, go you. But that is not what the fantasy genre is traditionally about or how it's structured. What exactly does that mean? So, to give y'all an example, in most fantasy stories, we're dealing with some sort of fantastical element, whether that is magic or some sort of magical realism, or just insert some sort of fantastical creature, society, magical people powers, whatever. There's something that is not the same as reality going on, but it is not scientific, because then that's sci-fi. And in order to create the reliability for your readers, this is the promise that you as a novelist make to your readers, is by making rules in how that magic or fantastical element works. Now, I know what a lot of y'all are thinking is, but it's fantasy. How can there be rules? Isn't fantasy supposed to be fantasy? And aren't rules the opposite of fantasy? Well, no. You need rules in order for fantasy to make sense. So, for instance, in the Lord of the Rings series, the one ring to rule them all. I would generally say most people know the Lord of the Rings series and the lore around the One Ring, the whole idea of that there were 7 rings given to all the different races, man, elves, dwarves, etc. And then there was the One Ring created by Sauron, which was this ring of power, and if you put it on, it makes you invisible, and all sorts of other stuff, and it can only be destroyed from whence it came, blah, 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 all that. Those are all rules. Like, I know it sounds like, oh, but it's this grandiose, fantastical thing. But there are rules. And one of the rules is, in order to be invisible, you have to physically put the ring on your finger. If you notice, throughout the Lord of the Rings series, whether you've only watched the movies or you've read the books or whatever, it's always mentioned that the ring only makes you invisible if you physically have it on your finger. You can carry it around in your pocket and you're not going to be invisible. By the same rule, whenever you put the ring on, the big scary Death Riders can find you. They can then see you. And if you carry it around in your pocket and it's not physically on your finger, they can't see you. So again, that's another rule. Total anarchy would be that there are just no rules that apply, that you could be invisible if you're carrying the ring, or you're standing next to the ring, or the ring is just within your vicinity and the Death Riders can find you regardless of if you have the ring or not. And, that would be the anarchy. And the rules are what make fantasy believable for your reader. You need to have some sort of structure, some sort of rules that these fantastical elements live by. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard for your reader to be able to understand your story, as well as that reliability contract that I talked about previously with your reader, is that you as the writer are basically making this contract with your reader in that you're like, okay, I'm going to give you this story, and I'm going to make it make sense so that you can enjoy these elements. And if you don't make that contract with your reader, guess what? They're not going to read your book. They're going to read a few pages of it, be like, this is crazy nonsense, and then ditch it. And now I know a common argument to that is, well, Alice in Wonderland is crazy nonsense. Yes. And as everybody knows, there are exceptions to the rules. But they are very difficult to successfully execute. And let's be real, y'all. How many other stories have any of y'all heard of that are as successful as Alice in Wonderland in that whole anarchy nonsensical way? Pretty sure there aren't many, if any, at all. And I'm sure many of y'all are going on Google now looking for some real obscure stuff. And if you have to Google obscure stuff, then that just proves the point that it's extremely difficult to execute that kind of nonsensical anarchy. And even so, Alice in Wonderland still does follow some semblance of rules, such as in Alice Through the Looking Glass, when the queen is talking to Alice and they are playing the game. She says, "Oh, we have to run in place, otherwise the scenery will change around us. That in order to stay where you are, you have to run really fast against the scenery." And I know that sounds completely bonkers and crazy, and I mean, it is because it's Alice in Wonderland, but that is a rule. That is a nonsensical rule that they created for the nonsensical world, as well as the nonsensical rule that if you piss off the Queen of Hearts, she's going to chop off your head. As silly as that sounds, it's a rule. And even in the most nonsensical fantasy, there are rules in place. Even if they aren't obvious to you as the reader, you're still going to pick up on them because it's this formula: if this, then that, because this. It's the formula of the chain of events, that if we do this, and then this is what's going to be the consequences. And that is the reasoning for these rules, is so that your reader can follow these chain of events of X plus Y equals Z. And typically with fantasy stories, that X plus Y is the storyline and the fantastical elements, and how that's going to translate into getting us to the ending or understanding the story or whatever. To piggyback off of this need for rules, the second biggest mistake that a lot of writers make with creating fantasy is that they incorporate way too many fantastical elements, or their fantastical elements are way too broad and general. One of the best things that you can do for your fantasy story is pick 1 to 3 elements and stick with that, because it can get overwhelming and crazy really fast. So for example, as much as we don't like to talk about She Who Shall Not Be Named of the TERFs, in the wizarding world of Harry Potter, the main fantastical element that is presented is magic in the terms of witchcraft. So there are different kinds of magic even in fantasy genres. And the fact that this book sticks very closely to one type of magic, even though there's lots of fantastical elements going on with, there's wizards and there's goblins and there's all kinds of magical creatures and there's werewolves and blah, blah, blah. There's all this different kind of stuff. It all fits in the context of witchcraft and the fact that most have to operate under certain rules of how that magic works, but then also it explains how some of it is a little bit different, such as Dobby the house elf, in that he can apparate and disapparate out of places that normally witches and wizards can't because magic rules. But it all fits under that umbrella of witchcraft, whereas Narnia fits under what is traditionally known as high fantasy magic. So going all the way back to like Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, Lancelot style magic. That is the kind of magic that is found in Narnia, in that it is this very deep, old magic, and it fuels the entire world. And when that magic starts to go away, the world starts to die. And in a certain sense, The Lord of the Rings is kind of that same old magic too, which is the whole idea of why man is kind of taking over the world, and the elves and the dwarves and all that are kind of going away because magic in the world is dying, and humans aren't magical creatures. They don't need magic in order to survive. So, you know, the dawn of their time is kind of coming on, and these magical people and creatures are kind of being displaced because of it. So those are two very completely different kinds of magic. And if you were to have deep old magic like that combined with witchcraft magic, those are some two huge concepts that would be a huge struggle to marry them together. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm sure there are some wonderful authors out there that have done it successfully, but you have to understand what that's going to take in order to shove two really big concepts like that into your story. So be aware of the fantastical elements that you are choosing to insert into your story, why you're choosing those elements, and how exactly they're going to fit together, and most importantly, how exactly you're going to explain all of that to your reader. Number 3, how are you going to explain all of this to your reader? The biggest mistake that a lot of writers make is the magical, omnipotent narrator info dump. Don't do that. We are well beyond the age of the once upon a time there was a magical land and let me narrate all of the things that you need to know right in the first 1 to 2 chapters of this book. We don't do that anymore. We as just people have moved beyond this type of storytelling. It's just not used anymore. We're beyond that. And if you do that to your readers, they're not going to want to read your book because honestly, in this day and age, it's lazy. It's the idea of show, not tell. And what that means is that you really need to be better about weaving these elements into the actual story so that your reader can experience these things rather than having them just said at them. And yes, you can insert some exposition, and if you're crafty enough, you can have your characters exposit some portions of details in your story, but you have to be careful about going about that. Another mistake that a lot of writers make in order to lift the burden of allowing their characters to exposit is to have the Mary Sue out of place character. So for instance, Alice falls down the rabbit hole and has no idea what's going on around her, and everything has to be exposited at her because she's not part of Wonderland and she doesn't understand this. Or the fact that you have kids who are from England and they fall into a closet and suddenly they're in Narnia and they have to be told, hey, all the animals talk here and there's magic and there's a crazy witch that wants to kill everybody, blah, blah, blah. Expository. All of that kind of stuff, again, we are getting away from that mode of storytelling of we're going to take clueless character and shove them in the stories that then all the characters around them have to exposit at them, and then that's how they relay information to the reader. We're really getting away from that as a writing industry, and we're having it more so that the reader experiences the story with the characters in the story rather than being clueless and bumbling through the story like the clueless bumbling character. It's just lazy writing, and yes, it is hard in order to marry all of these concepts together and make an engaging story, but I mean, that's the name of the game here. That's why you become a writer, is because you have a need to tell this story, and then you need to use the tools and the talent you have at your disposal in order to tell that story in the most successful possible way. And sometimes a big part of that is that it's hard. Which comes to my last point. One of the biggest and most annoying mistakes that writers make, and it's usually writers who either fantasy is not their main genre that they write, or it's their first time taking a crack at writing fantasy, is that for some reason people think that writing fantasy is easy. And the reason for this thinking is all of the things that I mentioned previously. And the first thing is because they think that it's just a bunch of anarchy and you're just making it up as you go along, that you can just exposit things with the big omnipotent narrator voice, and that your reader is just going to be okay with just not knowing what's going on because fantasy. No. Fantasy is not an easy genre to write. Is it a lot of fun to write? Oh yeah, it is. It is a blast to write fantasy. But by the same stroke, it's hard. For that exact reason, because you have to take your reader and you have to completely convince them that what is happening is real and that it has purpose. And that can be difficult to do, especially if you've decided to marry two very large, complicated concepts, or because you have built a massive overarching world for them to experience, if you've added in a lot of different creatures and elements and story plot lines, it's a lot to juggle. And it can be so challenging once people get into the thick of it and they realize that you can't just write, once upon a time a dragon and some magic and some whatever happened and then everybody did things and lived happily ever after the end. That's not really how the process goes. So those are the biggest pitfalls that I have seen so many writers take with writing fantasy. And for the takeaway, some of the biggest ways to circumvent those problems is, as I said, number one, at the get-go, choose what fantasy element or elements, a max of 3, that you want to incorporate in your story. Number two, you want to make sure that you are weaving these story elements throughout the actual story and not just expositing it at your reader. Talk about the environment. Talk about the history. Show them in the scenery itself, with them actually moving through a location, or them actually interacting with objects. Or even you can have your characters learn things. That's not the same as the bumbling idiot that has to be exposited at. You can absolutely have characters that have lived in this world their whole lives and they understand it, but are still learning, because that's reality. We as people every day are still learning. I mean, that's why you're here watching my videos, is to learn. So learning is always a great option for bringing up those facts that you need to bring up in your stories. And then, of course, last but not least, make sure you have a plan with how exactly you want your story to go. And while, yes, a big part of writing is the art of discovery and, for lack of a better term, making it up as you go along, it's a good idea to at least have some general semblance of what exactly you want to accomplish with the story. So I hope this has been helpful, y'all, and I want to thank y'all so very much for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a like, and if you're new, subscribe, and I will see y'all next time. Take care. Bye-bye.